I don't need to tell you that we are in difficult times, politically and culturally. We are tested constantly, trying to figure out what we can do. The picture on the front of your order of service is a sad and dramatic example. In DC on July 4th this year, hundreds of masked men, the white supremacist and anti-Semitic group Patriot Front, paraded around the US Capitol, carrying Confederate and upside-down American flags while chanting, "Reclaim America." To get to and from the event, they took the subway. Sitting there is a person whose right to ride that subway was only established 70 years ago and is still very fragile. The photo is a visual representation of how it feels to live inside racism, even when trying to mind your own business. As you know, this isn't an isolated case. ICE is killing people. Innocent people must hide. They can be kidnapped and disappear or be sent to countries where they face danger. Voting and elections are under attack. The press is intimidated. Free speech, especially in our universities, is being curtailed. I could go on, but you know. What does Unitarian Universalism have to say about meeting this moment? Let me begin, as I often do, with some history. How Unitarian Universalists have responded to social conditions we experienced or observed going back in our history. Until around 1960, Unitarians in particular were deeply embedded in the establishment. The Unitarians were New England-based and began as one church in town supported by taxpayer dollars. Our members, and definitely our leaders, were the elite. We engaged in little or no social criticism, neither by our members or our ministers, and we certainly did not feel threatened ourselves. The first big social issue was chattel slavery, and our responses were mixed. We honor Theodore Parker, a brave minister who was an ardent abolitionist, but a large share of our ministers and lay leaders were silent, with some expressing moderate opposition. Part of the reason was that we were the economic elite and had much to gain from slavery. In New England, where most of us were, the pews were filled with people who owned or served directly or indirectly the textile mills that relied on cheap cotton from the South. Ministers who opposed slavery knew who their parishioners were. Many of those who did speak out lost their jobs. Universalists focused largely on their message of universal salvation, on individual spiritual matters, and not on how their message might translate into social issues. Most of them were farmers and tradespeople, focusing on the work they needed to exist. Unitarians and Universalists did support the Civil War, except for the Unitarians and Universalists in the South, who were ardent secessionists and white supremacists. Reconstruction, they fell silent during Reconstruction when white supremacy was maintained, even though chattel slavery was gone. The Unitarians retained their elitism until the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries, most famously represented by Samuel Atkins Eliot, son of the president of Harvard, the first full-time salaried president of the American Unitarian Association. He believed in what was called manliness, which was so predominant in that era, best represented by Teddy Roosevelt. It was a common theme then. He made sure that women and people of color could not enter our ministry, for instance, because the manliness of the ministry was a precious value. He did have some exceptions where the men would not go, like Iowa. There were women ministers in Iowa. He was an opponent of immigration, a proponent of eugenics, and a defender of the Yankee ruling class. The Unitarians and the Universalists each had an academic leader who advocated for what was called the social gospel, which was a big theological movement within liberal Protestantism at that time. So for the Unitarians, Francis Greenwood Peabody at the Harvard Divinity School was an advocate. And for the Universalists, Clarence Skinner, who I did the reading of, was the principal advocate of the social gospel. So those made some impression on ministers, but not on our congregations as a whole. During this era, the one social justice issue that mattered broadly to Unitarians and Universalists was temperance. The evil liquor. And this was, again, reflected largely a class bias against immigrants and low-income people who attended the bars. They weren't interested in private consumption of alcohol. It was people going to the bars really bothered them. So amid this reticence and unwillingness to speak out on social justice issues, one event really sticks out, and that's the Sharps and their work through the new Unitarian Service Committee at the start of the Second World War, assisting refugees to escape Nazi terror. We lift up. Notice we do not lift up Samuel Atkins Elliott, but we lift up people like the Sharps. What is less acknowledged when we look at that act of heroism that they engaged in, was the institutional support behind those acts. First was the decision by the American Unitarian Association to establish the Unitarian Service Committee in the first place. Second was the decision that we needed to send people to Europe. Third was the president of the AUA, Frederick May Elliott, a cousin, I believe, of Samuel Atkins Elliott. There were lots of Elliots then. He recruited someone to undertake that task in Europe. It was not an easy sale to get someone to be willing to go to Europe to do what the Sharps did. They weren't his first choice. And fourth was the willingness of the Sharps congregation, the Unitarian Society of Wellesley Hills, where Sharp was the minister, to grant him leave and of church members to volunteer to take care of the children. So it wasn't just an individual act of courage. It was an institutional commitment that they engaged in. Everything started to change. This reticence, this caution, around 1960. Was it, I think, coincidental that the Unitarians and the Universalists merged at that time, but it was around 1960. And it's coincidental that that's around when this congregation was established, founded. Civil rights ignited energy among Unitarian Universalists that nothing else had done. So our first UUA president, Dana McLean Greeley, established the precedent that a Unitarian Universalist, the president of our denomination, speaks out all the time, consistently on social justice issues, goes to demonstrations, gets arrested. That's one of the common feature among all the presidents. They all have a police record. They all speak out regularly on whatever the issue might be. UUA organized significant presence at the March on Washington in 1963. Significant presence. I do an annual Facebook post showing pictures of them getting on and off the buses. They were both UU adults and many UU youth went to that event and marched. In the same year, our General Assembly, the annual convention, began to pass social justice resolutions, as they do every single year. They also examined their own practices. In 1963, the most hotly debated issue at the General Assembly was, will we allow segregated congregations to be members of the association? They were in the South. There were plenty of them in the South, a few in the North. That was hotly debated. And the next big crack was Selma, 1965, when Martin Luther King sent out his request for ministers to show up for that march. Almost every Unitarian Universalist minister went there. Something like 90% went there. We were overrepresented by any significant measure. And those ministers had conversion experience at Selma and came back and preached what they had learned at Selma. And that was the biggest transformation in terms of our own commitment to social justice. That was only 60 years ago. Only 60 years ago. And it just went on from there. And in the interest of time, you can read the text of the rest of that history lesson. In any event, starting in the 1990s, for the most part, we began to become completely what we are today, a consistently progressive voice. No debates about segregated congregations and any of that kind of stuff. Consistently progressive voice for social justice, engaging in protest. I recall meeting the minister of Old South Church in Boston in the late 1990s. When she discovered my church affiliation, she said, "Oh, I so admire the Unitarian Universalists, the social protest church." It was intended as a compliment and certainly can be seen that way. I recall recoiling, not so that she could see, but recoiling a little bit, because I see social justice activities as an outcome of our core beliefs, but not really as our core beliefs. Our core beliefs are encompassed by values like love, kindness, equity, human dignity. So to be labeled a protest church seemed to me cheap and shallow, even though it's an important part of our practice. So we have earned that label. We can be proud to have done so. How are we earning that label now? National Unitarian Universalism continues to be punching way above our weight as a voice for everything we hold dear. Remember how tiny we are in the religious landscape. Only a few 100,000 people all over the country. That's it. And yet we are on the front lines of every mobilization, every coalition of religious groups. We are there. Most recently in Minneapolis, and our own minister was there. Our ministers speak consistently from the pulpit, and they, along with many lay leaders, get arrested. The UUA endowment is a leader in shareholder activism. The UUA General Assembly passes its resolutions. Our leadership speaks up. Our individual members go to demonstrations, speak up at meetings, and give generously of our time and effort. One characteristic that I've heard others say of us that I do like without reservation is we show up. We are the people who show up. what are we called to do now? Unfortunately, the best lens for understanding our times is the Nazi one. The pattern is eerily similar. Order is needed. Racial predominance is paramount. Scapegoats are targeted. Wars are fought. And like the Nazi takeover, it is occurring over several years, not all at once. But there are differences, thank goodness. First, the Germans who worried about the rise of the Nazis didn't have an example of the rise of the Nazis in their past to warn them. They were kind of making it up as it went along. They had to figure it out without any precedents. Second, and far more important, in Germany, there was really no organized opposition to the Nazi takeover. Once Hitler had been elected chancellor, there had been before that, but once he was elected chancellor, the opposition stopped. But here, now, in the United States, the opposition is significant and won't let up. In Germany, there was acquiescence. Here, there is resistance. There is opposition in the Congress and in the lower courts that at least slows things up. Doesn't stop it, but it slows it. There is significant media coverage of the atrocities for the roughly half the people who believe what those reports say. Remember, so few believe those reports. There are the actions of organized groups, political, cultural, and religious, that continue to resist. I'm especially knowledgeable about universities, and am proud that so many of them have taken principled stands. Not enough, but some. Some of what we do as individuals can seem like mere gestures, or to keep our own mental health and sense of balance, and to change the world. Those gestures are important for those reasons alone. One reason to do gestures is to remind people, and especially each other, of our core principles, so that people can come to them when they are ready. The Germans were silent. We show up. Go back to history for a minute. There are many examples of resistance to the Nazis during that period, the Sharps being one of them. But another Unitarian is Norbert Čapek, who is a Czech minister who became a Unitarian, fled the country, but then returned in the midst of the Nazi terror. And we know him mostly as the creator of the Flower Communion. But he died in a Nazi concentration camp. And outside of our narrow UU communion, remember, a couple 100,000, that's it. We're punching above our weight, but we're small. Outside of that is the example of the German Lutheran pastor and theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I'm going to quote him. So remember that when he refers to Christ, that word is a metaphor that you may know as a source of truth, goodness, and light, but not literally. Bonhoeffer didn't advise sacrificial heroism, but rather tactical seizing of opportunity when it emerged. He knew that facts and reasoning would not persuade. It's a particularly hard lesson for Unitarian Universalists. Look at the evidence. Facts and reasoning do not persuade. He knew that change would occur when support for fascism weakened in the actual experience of its supporters. That requires patience that isn't easy to muster. He said, Jesus himself did not try to convert the two thieves on the cross. He waited until one of them turned to him. Your opponents need to be ready to hear. He was a fan of patience and enduring bad times rather than simply lashing out in the futile hope of immediate gratification. We know much too little, he said, in the church today about the peculiar blessing of bearing. Bearing, not shaking off, bearing, not collapsing either, bearing, as Christ bore the cross. And he advised adhering to religious principles, holding fast rather than worshiping power or giving in. He would have been appalled at what we call Christian nationalists. He said, Jesus Christ lived in the midst of his enemies. At the end, all his disciples deserted him. On the cross, he was utterly alone, surrounded by evildoers and mockers. For this cause, he had come to bring peace to the enemies of God. For this cause, he had come to bring peace. So the Christian, too, belongs not in the seclusion of a cloistered life, but in the thick of foes. Christianity stands or falls with its revolutionary protest against violence, arbitrariness, and the pride of power, and with its plea for the weak. Christians are doing too little to make these points clear. Christendom adjusts itself far too easily to the worship of power. Christians should give more offense, shock the world far more than they are doing now. So we must show patience, fortitude, presence, showing up. We must speak up, not expecting to persuade, but to keep alive the values and principles we hold dear. Repeat those words of our UUA president. Immerse yourself unapologetically in what it means to be a Unitarian Universalist in these days. Then go out into the world and live knowing that your faith matters. May the poetry of our hearts set us free.
May the long time sun shine upon you. All love surround you, and the pure light within you. God